Hello, and welcome to our webinar series called What Do the KAS for Social Studies Look Like in Practice? This webinar series is designed to deepen your social studies content knowledge and your pedagogical skills when you are implementing the Kentucky Academic Standards for Social Studies. This particular webinar is going to be about Grade 1 Kentucky history. As we continue and go through our webinar series, the topics will change per the webinar that we are offering. Our webinar goals for today is that we are going to learn about how to design instructional experiences aligned to the KAS for Social Studies by engaging in a demonstration about Kentucky history. So the goal of today is to have you really understand how to engage and have your students learn more about Kentucky history. Our success criteria. I can analyze 1HKH1 to understand what this standard requires students to know and be able to do. Next, I can improve my content knowledge and pedagogical skills after exploring a grade level sample. So first, when we're engaging in any work that is aligned to the Kentucky Academic Standards for Social Studies, we always want to take a moment and really identify and analyze and understand what standards are. So if you look at the slide, the slide says standards define what students should know, understand, and be able to do at the end of the grade level. Remember, they're the floor, not the ceiling. So a definition of know refers to the facts, dates, places, people, definitions, rules, or information that is included within the standard. Understand refers to theories, generalizations, or big ideas. What are we asking students to know and understand within that standard? Do. It refers to the skills required within the standard, such as communication, reading, computation, application, and transfer to new situations. These three terms and understanding what the standard is asking students to know, understand, and do as they're engaging with the standard is really essential to ensuring that students are mastering the grade level content and skills that the KAS for Social Studies requires that students do. What does it mean to unpack a standard? So all unpacking a standard means is to really look at the components of a standard to ask and to understand what students should be able to know, understand, and do. So really, when you break a standard down, if you look at that first bullet, it's all about breaking the standard into smaller, more explicit chunks for the purposes of curriculum development and/or unit and lesson planning. So if you see on the next bullet, it talks about, for example, analyze a verb in the following standard to determine its meaning in terms of instruction and assessment. We see this word understand again. So understand the development of important community traditions and events. So what does understand mean in this standard? Does it mean to make meaning of, or does it mean to transfer your knowledge? Does it mean to accurately state and explain, or does it simply mean to know? What does a verb demand in terms of student learning? It's also really important to know that knowing what the standard is asking students to know and be able to do, it actually goes beyond just the verb in the standard. Maybe this first part of the standard has the verb in it, and the second part of the standard also requires students to do more of the content and skills that they're learning. So really, when you break down the standard, like it says in that first bullet, it's really about breaking it down into its chunks. What is it asking students to know and be able to do with the verb, and with the verb in consideration of the rest of the information that's provided in the rest of the sentence. So next, you see the title of the slide is Doing This Together. Breaking down a standard in social studies is really a collegial activity, meaning that this works best when you are able to do this with your peers. If you see there, the first line says, breaking down the standards allows for collegial conversations that should result in a common agreement on the learning expectations. It should be done as a team. So as in your team, whether that's your grade level team or your PLC, you would do these 4 ideas. So 1, you would define the language of the standard. 2, you would determine the level of the rigor indicated in part through the verb used and the grade level of the standard. Do you remember part of that rigor is also about that other part of the sentence? Yes, it's about the verb, but what else is the standard and the sentence structure demanding of the students? 3, analyze and translate to better incorporate into curriculum, unit, and lesson plans. 4, analysis is essential at the local level if the standards are to be validly and consistently taught among teachers. It's essential that you and your colleagues understand what the standards mean, and how best to implement them as you are working on implementing these with your students.
Okay, so now we're going to use our tool to unpack standards to look at the standard that we are going to be focusing on today. So these are the components of the tool to unpack standards that we're going to look at today. So you can see step 1 is identifying the standard. Step 2 is looking at what knowledge, concepts, and vocabulary students need to know to reach the standard. And then next, what skills they need to have, and then the level of proficiency that they need as well. So first, we've inserted the standard. So again, our standard that we are going to be looking at today is compare life in Kentucky in the past to life in Kentucky today. Next, looking at the knowledge, concepts, and vocabulary that students need to know, you can see in the standard that it says life in Kentucky in the past and life in Kentucky today. So those are the concepts that kids are going to need to be able to identify. So next, to really get into that section and get a little bit more about what kids may need to know to help them really to master this standard, we can look at the disciplinary clarifications. So here's the disciplinary clarification for this standard. So it says life in Kentucky communities is affected by customs, gender roles, ethnic and cultural groups, available transportation, technology, education, and recreation, among others, and these change over time. Students may compare the similarities and differences of life of an American Indian before colonization to their own life, or the life of an early Kentucky settler to their own life. So taking what we just looked at for the disciplinary clarifications, we can add to that section about the knowledge that students can gain to help them with this standard. And so you can see there the different components that I just read have been added as considerations for knowledge that students can gain to help with this standard. And so next, it asks what skills students need to be able to reach the standard. So you can see there the verb is compare. So the skills students really need here is to be able to compare. So not only do they need to be able to identify those components that are listed in the knowledge, but they need to go a little step further and they need to be able to compare the two things. And so the level of proficiency that compare would be a 3. So this is going to be a DOK 3 for grade 1 students to be able to truly make that comparison between the different areas of the content. So now we're going to turn it over to our partner at the Kentucky Historical Society. Katie Turer is here, and she is going to walk you through an investigation that is going to be a way that this standard could be taught with instruction in your classroom.
Hi there. I'm Katie Turer. Thanks for that introduction, and I'm with the Kentucky Historical Society. If you're not familiar with the Kentucky Historical Society, we are the state museum and repository for historical collections for Kentucky. There are 3 historic sites, or 3 sites where we are housed in Frankfort, and our main one is the Kentucky History Center. That's where our largest exhibits are. And that's actually where I got the idea for this particular investigation. I was walking through A Kentucky Journey, which is our main exhibit. It covers 12,000 years of Kentucky history, which is obviously well before statehood. And there are several different house replicas or representations from all throughout Kentucky's history. And I thought it would make a really great comparison opportunity for students as they're thinking about Kentucky past up until the present. So why don't we dive in here? We are going to explore today, again, homes in Kentucky through history. The overview is that students will be investigating how Kentucky's communities have changed by analyzing how homes and objects in homes are similar and different to their house today. The compelling question that I started with is, how is life at home in my community today different than it was in the past? And the supporting question is, how have homes and the objects in them changed over time? Again, you see the standard that we were just talking about that is connected to this investigation. So compare life in Kentucky in the past to life in Kentucky today. Now, before we dive into the homes themselves and some of the information, I just wanted to spend a moment talking about objects as sources. I think a lot of the times we think about primary sources specifically as documents and letters and things that convey written information, even photographs. Are very logical as primary sources, but as a museum, we rely on all of those items, plus objects and paintings and other things as well. So a source, just as a reminder, is anything that communicates a message. And what that means for our investigation today is looking at the objects found in homes. So there are a few specific topics that I tried to pull out in each location: cookware, furniture, decorations, lighting, all the things that are very comparable that you can compare throughout. But there are a lot of other things I didn't pull out that you might gravitate toward more. And I highly encourage you to kind of follow those interests and look at those objects as well. Objects are personal, so they represent the people who use them. And I think that makes them a really great way to see how people have changed and how life has changed throughout history. And lastly, as you see here, analyzing objects does help students. If they're able to have an object in their hand, they really get to use all of their senses to read the object, to get to know it. And even if they don't have the object in their hand, they can still use their past experience, their general knowledge to build an understanding of what that object is and maybe how it's different than other objects that they might be more familiar with, or yeah, it allows for that comparison. So just wanted to give you an overview of the 5 spaces that we'll be looking at today. Like I said, these are all throughout a Kentucky journey, and we'll start with Native people and the houses that they lived in this area. We'll move on to a log cabin. There's also a Victorian parlor and a rural kitchen, a farm kitchen in the 1930s, and then a little bit more modern, a 1960s living room. These are the 5 images, or these are the 5 locations that I'm pulling out, but I've kind of hoped to design this investigation with the idea that it can be flexible for you. So you can look at one of these images with your students, or you can look at all 5. It is completely up to you. And yeah, this is kind of just the overview for you to then explore with your students. So diving in, we've got our archaic period house first. And this is the type of house that Kentucky's early people, early Native people would have lived in. And not just here in Kentucky, but all across the region. You can see it dates back 3,000 to 5,000 years ago, and could have been used year-round or temporarily. And you can see it's made of dried plants. So this is kind of your overall snapshot of what this house looked like. And then for this one in particular also, I have a short tour. Oh, I'll get there in a second. Sorry about that. Here's some up-close pictures of what the objects in the house look like. So you can see baskets, a hollowed-out gourd. There's also the fire pit, which would have provided light and warmth, and a cooking location. And we also have an animal fur. And then up next now is the tour of the archaic period house. So we'll take a second to watch this video, hopefully. Welcome to the Kentucky Historical Society's exhibit, A Kentucky Journey. We're here today in the gallery called Kentucky's Early People, which explores the history of Native people who were living in this area for thousands of years before Kentucky became a state. We're going to explore the archaic period house today, which is behind me. This is an example of a house from over 3,000 years ago. First, let's look and see what the house was made out of. So we see that there is wood here. That is the framing for this whole house. And then there are dried plants. These are cattail plants. And cattail plants were very useful for Native people because they were durable. They would last for a number of years before needing to be replaced. And they could be moved from one house to another if the families decided that they needed to move. Let's take a look at what's inside the house now. We see some woven baskets, a hollowed out gourd. These would be used to store items. We also see an animal fur that would have been used to make clothing or blankets to keep warm. And we also see a fire pit that would have been in the very middle of the room, used for cooking and to keep the space warm. This was all one big space in the house. Native people at this time would have lived in villages with many other families. They may have lived in their houses all year long, or they may have lived in smaller communities as they traveled to hunt or to go other places in the area. Awesome. So now we'll move on to our next house. So the next house that we're exploring is the log cabin. And this would have been built by settlers who were moving into Kentucky, or before Kentucky was a state, moving into this area primarily from the east. So it was a pretty traditional type of house for a very long time. It was in use for quite a while. And you all may even be familiar with log houses that are still standing today. When settlers were first moving out and they would build this one-room log cabin, they may then build onto it over time to expand the house. And they may also have to furnish some of the items inside of it. If you think about these long journeys, traveling over mountains or on the river, you probably can't bring everything with you, and this is a really big move to make. So then you have to think about what you're putting inside of the house when you get here as well. Let's look at some of those objects in the house. So we have, starting on the left, a candle, which is really important for lighting. If you noticed, there are no windows in this house. So once it gets dark, you have to be able to light the inside of your house. The second picture is a butter churn. Right over from there, that is the fireplace with some cooking tools in front of it. So that would have also been used for light and warmth and cooking, kind of like that first fire that we saw. And then we have some beds. So there's a bigger bed and a trundle bed, and you'll get a better picture of that here in just a second, because this is the second location where we have a video. So for the two kind of full houses, I created these little videos for you to either use yourselves to learn about the spaces before you talk to your students, or to show in the classroom. Either way. We'll go ahead and get this one started too. Welcome to the Kentucky Historical Society's exhibit, A Kentucky Journey. We're in the Frontier Gallery today, exploring the history of what life was like for settlers moving out to this area over 200 years ago. We're going to be exploring the log cabin, which is a one-room log cabin, and take a look at what this house is made out of. So this is a log cabin made of big logs of wood, like we can see right here. They're kind of puzzle pieced together as they're stacked up, like Lincoln logs if you've ever played with that. They fit right into each other. As we take a look inside, you can see that there are some things you may recognize and other things that look different to you. We'll start out looking over here by the fireplace. So this is where cooking would have happened in the one-room log cabin. And you can see there are pots and pans of different sizes. There's some ladles or big spoons in the back and other cooking tools. Here in the middle of the room, we see two beds. There's a bigger bed and a smaller bed. The smaller bed is called a trundle bed, and it could slide all the way under the bigger bed so that there's more space during the day for activities. On this side of the room, there's a large table, and we see a bowl on it. In the back cabinet, you can also see plates and mugs and other things that you may traditionally see on a table. But in this area, we also see some tools. So we see a spinning wheel. The spinning wheel would be used to make thread for fabric and make blankets or clothing. We also see a butter churn in the corner. That would be used to make butter and cheese from cow's milk. And we see candles and a candle mold. So the candles are on the wall, and there's a candle mold in the cabinet. Candles would have been an important piece of material for settlers and for people living in the house because it's the only way that you can light the house when it gets dark. All right. So we'll move on to our next house. This is the Victorian parlor, which dates back to about the 1900s. And you'll see that this is a very different house from the log cabin. It's really the first time that we're seeing decorations. The Victorian parlor would have been the space to entertain guests. So it might be the room to kind of show off a little bit in. Um, and this is a time when folks are moving kind of more into cities, and things are becoming mass produced, or you don't have to make all of your furniture yourself. You can more easily purchase items. And we'll take a closer look at some of those items that might be available more easily. So the first item on the left is a decorative piece, which is hanging on the wall, and again might be there to sort of as a talking piece for your guests. We also have a chandelier, much more ornate than the candles that we saw in the last house, and we have an organ. Musical instrument, again, very decorative. The table as well is much more intricately designed and has a couple different materials. It's not just a wood table. It's got that kind of top piece that is marble or something of that nature. The fourth house we're going to look at is the 1930s kitchen. And this is kind of picturing a farm family. And what I like about this house is that there's some old items and some newer items kind of all in the same space. So you're going to have, well, let's get some up close pictures here. We've got a hand crank butter churn. So this is like the butter churn that we saw in the log cabin, but different materials. It's got a crank, not just kind of the up and down motion of the wood stick. We also have a wood burning stove. You can see the table there as different than the other tables that we've seen. It's different materials. It's maybe not as decorative as the last one, but it's still more modern, and there's no wood on it. And then lastly, I don't know if you know what that image is of, but that's a radio. That was one of the early radios. So we have, again, kind of the older items in the house where you still have to hand crank your butter churn, but you can be listening to the radio while you're doing it. The last space we're going to explore is the 1960s living room. So at this point in time, people are moving into the cities even more. Suburbs are growing, neighborhoods are growing, and we're seeing much more modern appearances of furniture and also entertainment opportunities. So again, let's take a closer look at some of the objects in here. You can see that there is a television for the first time, and an electric lamp sitting on top of it. So that has a plug. It plugs in just like ours do today, much more advanced than what we've seen in the last couple of images. We also see a record player with some really cool speakers, those blue kind of towers. Those are speakers. Again, really showing off that entertainment part of the 1960s. And then you also see some chairs and table that are, again, much more modern. These are going to be mass produced. And there's even a decorative clock on the wall, which I really like. I thought that was cool. I didn't realize it was a clock initially, but again, just kind of showing how style changes over time too. So now we get into the actual activity portion, now that you've seen the content. So in this investigation, we are going to start out by asking students to draw a picture of their house. So they should spend a little bit of time, however they would like to do it. You can see I've done it 2 different ways, drawing a picture of what's inside of my house. What are the things that stand out to me? And those are bedrooms, the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom. There's even a closet in one of them, and some of the items that we find inside. So beds, a dresser, the refrigerator, a stovetop, a television. There's all sorts of different things in here that represent kind of what I think of when I think of home. So that's what we'll first ask the students to do. And then we're going to ask them to take a look at one of the images. I would recommend starting off using one. You can certainly use more, either of the pictures or the videos, to get a good idea of one of the historic house spaces. And then we're going to ask them to, as a class, help create a Venn diagram of what the historic house is versus their house, and compare those items that are similar and different between the two. So yeah, like I said, I'd recommend doing this as a class. We can draw pictures, we can write words. It is completely up to you all, to your students, as long as we're getting that idea across of the comparison of what's similar and different. And then we are going to ask the students to think about it on their own a little bit more and write or draw the answers to the following prompts. How have homes and the objects in them changed over time? And also to compare life in Kentucky from the past to life in Kentucky today. And those can be, I mean, even some of the images that I have on this slide, that there are fireplaces or candles, not lamps. There's a lot that can be pulled out, I think, from comparing one's current house to one of these previous houses. And like I said, you can certainly do this with multiple houses, or if you want to compare the houses together and look at maybe change over time, not to total present, but between the houses, there are comparisons to be made. That's perfectly fine as well. But building up to that present time, I think, will really help hit the standard. And then I have one other extension activity to offer you all, and that is to use these house images to create a timeline of sorts. So kind of like you saw on that early slide with the 5 houses on the same timeline, I am going to ask the students to look at all of the pictures and see if they can put the houses in order from oldest to newest. And one of the ways that they can do this is by looking at some of the items in the house and comparing them, seeing like these two butter churns, which one looks older? Why does it look older? And does that help classify how old the house might be? I'm not looking for dates at this point. It's really just putting them in order of which house came first versus more recently. So that is all of the slides that I have to offer for this activity or these activities. I will recommend taking a look at the lesson and the documents that break down the information, because there are more questions that I have for you to ask your students or to think about. There's also several of the images pulled out specifically for each house. And if they are collections items, which most of them are, you can find the link to the object website and you can find out more about that object. So there's more to explore should you want to explore it. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen.
And we want to thank you so much, Katie, for the partnership with the Kentucky Historical Society and for you joining us today. We're really appreciative to learn more about the items that the Kentucky Historical Society has in their collection and how we can use those in classrooms. And for anyone who's watching, if you want to access all of those additional pieces that Katie mentioned at the end of her presentation, those materials will be available on kystandards.org under the Social Studies resource section. So please access those if you would like to implement this with your own students or to learn more for yourself. So thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.